used the American Red Cross as their first aid training, and the few that had any training. And some of the equipment they used were things like old doctor's bags. And this is called a Shell MD doctor's bag that's actually been in production for well over 50 or 60 years. And this is an early model of that a lot of the times used. Even the Heartmobile and other agencies would use these to carry their equipment. One of the things I have in my collection, a lot of, is snake bite kits. We had a lot of over the years, a lot of talk about how you dealt with snake bites, and there was a lot of cut and suck and put tourniquets on, which are none of the things we do today. And so there's snake bite kits in my collection that I'm proud to have, and obviously the little first aid kits. Some of the early training manuals, besides the first aid books, one of the first national EMT curriculums was put on by the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, and this is the Emergency Care and Transportation Sick and Injured. And this is still in production, obviously a much thicker book, and it's probably in its 10th edition by now. So, but as we move forward here, one of the early models of monitor defibrillator with tape writer that was put together is by Physio Control. And many people remember the LifePak 5s and LifePak 10s, 11s. Now we're up to the LifePak 15s. This is a LifePak 4. And they started off with what they called the Model 33, LifePak 33, and it was because it was 33 pounds. Then they went with the LifePak 3, and then the LifePak 4. And this is an early morning model of it. It weighs about 50 pounds, so it's much heavier than what we use today. The other interesting thing that hard to believe people when we talk about the history of EMS is, used to be that we did a lot of reusing items. I remember actually cleaning oxygen masks and nasal cannulas with alcohol and reusing them. Today we throw all those away. But bag valve masks is a good example of that. Bag valve masks were all non-disposable. They, self-refilling bags. This one has a sponge rubber inside to it. All of them have a one-way valve, obviously, in a mask. But this was the original version of the Ambu mask. This is made by Ambu. It comes in a nice little case like this, and they threw along a little foot suction unit, which was common on ambulances for a backup suction unit for the ambulance, which was required in the early days when the early specifications by the federal government for equipment, you had to have backup suction, you had to have certain items, and that was a common item. Oxygen used to be steel tanks. We now enjoy aluminum tanks, much lighter, much easier to use, and go from there. This thing is a lot of different airway equipment, things that I like to point out to people. One of the common resuscitating items besides bag valve mask is things like the demand valve. And demand valves were oxygen powered, push the button cycle type of resuscitator, which you can also use as an inhaler. You put it up the mask and they can over-breathe in it. The problem of it was the pressures weren't very commonly regulated until later years, so probably blew a lot of people's lungs out using the demand valve. So remember today's adage is that you blow until the chest rises. Well, if you let the chest rise too much, then that causes problems. But other things that are kind of interesting is things like the Lairdell, which is obviously one of the companies that makes products today. This is a jet suction unit, which has an aerosol can that generates the suction. And I actually had the chance of using one of those way back in my early career. And this is an early Lairdell pocket mask, folded in half as opposed to folded flat like they are today. So interesting little pieces of history as we go here.
Yes.
And then moving on down, one of the things we have that was common in the early paramedic days was a way in which we could talk to the hospital and transmit EKGs, and the term we call that is telemetry. And so we would take the information off of in the case of this, off of this datascope a monitor, and connect it to the radio, and we could transmit. These radios were big, they're heavy. Now you can do if you wanted to, you could do all the same things on a little, half-pound radio instead of a 25, 30-pound radio. So, as we proceed here, you look and see things like modern drug box in the 1970s. I kind of copied this off of the television show Emergency. This is the same drug box that they used on that show. And these are all period correct equipment from that time period. And you can see that the drugs were minimal. IVs came in bottles instead of bags, which certainly had to worry about breakage and those kind of things. And so having them in a container that was a fishing tackle box at the time. So we went from the doctor's bags to the fishing tackle boxes to help protect a lot of this equipment. Goes from there. So as time progressed, we got better. We went from Thomas half-ring traction splints to the hair traction splint. And a gentleman who was a police officer out in San Diego named Glenn Hare came up with this device because he saw the need for something to protect people from actually dying from bleeding and from femur fractures. And Glenn Hare took the Thomas half ring, which is I have a model of it, but I don't have it with me. But went from that to something that was a little bit easier to use, and it was called the hair traction splint. He later started a company called Dynamed, which became the big provider of EMS equipment for across the nation, and was really popular. That later got bought out by Gulls that we all are familiar with today. So this is another early defibrillator model. Actually, came out in the 80s, called the MRL 450 SL. We liked it because you can at least remove the monitor portion of that and carry it with the patient. But even that is fairly heavy. And as you can see, the way it's built like a tank, and you can drop it, and rarely could you damage that. And then this is probably one of the most popular EKG monitors out there that was used. This came to be in the late 70s and was really popular all the way up to the 90s. And this is the LifePak 5 made by Physio Control. And again, one of the common themes was you could separate the monitor from the defibrillator. So all of us would say that's heresy today, that you would not have the defibrillator with your patient. But if you're transporting a patient and you just wanted to monitor them, then you could do that. So that was a very common and very nice device to use. And then looking at textbooks, I was pointing out to some other people, is Ohio was one of the few states in the country that had its own EMT curriculum early on. And it started with basically manuals for firefighters called Emergency Rescue Squad manuals, and moved up to what became the Emergency Victim Care Manual. And pretty much anybody who has been an EMT for over 20, 25 years here in Ohio, this was their textbook. And the different variations of it, they had modules, so they didn't have to revise the whole book every time. They could revise a module and made it a little bit cheaper. But these are one of the common books for a lot of us that have been in the business for 25 years or more. And then here's a copy of what we call Emergency Care in the Streets, which is written by Nancy Carolyn. She was a physician over in the Pittsburgh area, and literally up to about 1980 there wasn't a textbook for paramedicine. So we've been in the EMS advanced life support business for probably 8 years before we ever had a manual that was specifically had everything in it from A to Z. And I laugh at my paramedic students. Now we have modules, but this is the thickness of one module, let alone the whole book. So, Zenith model, which neither of us have seen before, and I said, you can watch cartoons on it, I guess, because I always thought Zenith was a TV manufacturer. And from there, you can see fairly, probably 15-year-old Zoll model. 18, yeah, and the Physio Control LifePak 12, which is 17 years old. So those are still used today, but are quickly becoming phased out. And then on the end there, you see what we call a data scope, the MD2J. This was a common model if those that are familiar with the TV show Emergency. Eventually this was the unit that they used on that TV show, which was popular for EMS. And again, like the others, you can take the monitor and separate it from the defibrillator. It was just too darn heavy. Batteries weren't what they were today, so everything is equipment. And I tell people, the amazing thing about EMS history is that the equipment's gotten lighter and smaller, but the patients have gotten bigger. So that's just it.
And I know the Zenith you were talking about earlier, Dan, was 60 some pounds. I mean,
Zenith weighs about 68 pounds. To make it a little easier to transport, I removed the battery and the capacitors out of it.
We think this was often used by the military, and everything the military used was overbuilt for durability and
Right.
and dropping out of helicopters and things like that. So that's probably why it's so heavy. So
Literature I found on it shows that the Marine Corps used it in a lot of their medical helicopters about 1972. You need a helicopter to lift it. It's pretty heavy. It's a stout piece of equipment.
and so speaking of military, the EMU mask is also military.
It is military. It's made about 1941. It's a bellows style.
Easily detachable.
And it doesn't
Easily
work.
detachable.
Wow.
You see that?
Well, it stays on there, but you got to hold
You
that.
gotta hold it like this.
You have to have two people.
You hold it like that. See?
Oh, I thought these were hand.
Well, no, it's where you put your thumb. It depends on the size of your thumb. But you would hold it like that. Turn the mask sideways and put it on your patient. And
So how old do you think that is?
this was made in 1941, so it's 70, 80 years old. You see it's starting to come apart now. But before it really started to dry rot, it would move a lot of air. It was a great amount of air. Also has an inlet for oxygen if you want to put supplemental oxygen on them. It's really it's a unique piece. It's Bakelite on the outside. Actually, it's the only one I've ever seen.
It's called a Portman.
I think it's
Resuscitator?
Portman, yeah. I can't read very well without my glasses, but I do believe it's made by Portman. It came out of a large military resuscitator kit that I had bought.
No, I think
unique.
it's a really cool piece of equipment, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely unique. I've not seen any like it, and it's kind of the basis of what we use now. It's just a different way of getting air into someone.
They actually have come back to making a few models that are bellows style bag valve mask resuscitators.
So I think the bellows
that are
actually-
disposable actually.
To me, they seem to they move a lot more air than a squeeze type.
Yeah, it makes sense.
We can get a whole lot of air into somebody with this thing. Even with the holes in it, if you were to move it, there's a significant amount of air that's coming out of there. It does. It's really good at ventilating someone.
Well, thank you guys so much for
Well, you're welcome.
talking to us. Again, this is the guys for History of Modern EMS. You can like them on Facebook and check out cool pictures of all the stuff they have here.